Hi, this is Andrew Sears, and I'm going to give a summary of Clinton's Making of a Leader, but especially focus it on the concept of what he calls the reflective evaluation pattern. And let me just give an overview of that pattern. So Clinton's generic timeline comes as a result of his research into the lives of hundreds of biblical, historical, and contemporary leaders. He has 6 generic phases. They're a common way that God works in the lives of men and women as they're shaped over a lifetime. Now, he talks a lot about the term ministry, but we believe that everyone is in ministry, so we'll talk a little bit more about that. So let me just talk about the stages. So sovereign foundations is the initial phase. It's where God works in the life of the individual from birth. So he uses factors such as family heritage, culture, environment, and early life experiences to shape the person towards God's purposes. And sometimes there's deep wounding that might happen in that, but God can even redeem those things. Thus, from an early age, the individual's responsiveness to God's shaping and influence is important for later leadership selection and development. Now, the transition from sovereign foundations to inner life growth really is whenever someone decides to become a Christian. So they enter into a Christian community, they learn to pray, they immerse themselves in some type of service or ministry, and it could be, ministry in the business world. So, but they start to see themselves and believe the worldview that everyone is a minister. And the purpose of this phase is the identification of leadership potential and developing the character and the young leader's life. So you go from that phase into ministry maturing, and that's the third phase, and the young leader begins to touch the lives of others in ministry, and you start to discover your leadership gifts, and that could be some developing natural abilities, acquired skills, or spiritual gifts. And the ministry maturing phase has 2 parts. The first part focuses on the use of one's unique mix of gifts to deliver ministry with increasing effectiveness, while the second part focuses on the person's character, where God allows you to experience lessons on how to work with people, submit to, and exercise authority. So even though ministry takes part during the first 3 phases, this isn't the goal. I've often heard the phrase, God's not making an organization, he's making a person. He's not making a ministry, he's making a person. So the main goal is for God to develop your ultimate potential and your character. So in the 4th phase, this is called life maturing. You experience role transitions. You might have some crises, isolation, crises, conflict, and that's going to draw you closer to God. So your ministry becomes more focused, and it arises more out of your relationship with God. And others start to see that you more as a spiritual authority in their life as you help them grow their experience and knowledge of God. So the last 2 stages we're going to kind of throw together. Convergence. God moves a leader into a role that matches that person's individual giftedness and experience, and you're freed from ministry where you're not gifted. I find a lot of people who, they graduate college and they're 22 and they expect to have convergence. Most people are lucky if they have convergence by age 50. Just recognizing that it's a journey to get to convergence. And, what happens in convergence is your ministry effectiveness is maximized, and, your convergence is demonstrated as you're responding consistently to God's work in your life. So an afterglow is really a very few people reach that. So that would be someone like Billy Graham during the last years of his life. So he wasn't so much out leading these rallies as he was just a sage that a lot of people look to. And that's where you have indirect and sustaining influence beyond their own personal network. Now, in most of the assignments in this course, we're going to be focused on, rather than 6 stages, we're going to simplify that down to 4 stages. So what we're doing is we're essentially combining the sovereign growth and inner life growth into phase 1, and ministry maturing is going to be phase 2, phase 3, and then convergence and afterglow is going to be combined into phase 4. So these are going to be the 4 phases we're going to use throughout the course and in our assignments and in the timelines that you use. And the idea is that, even though these phases are even, for a lot of people, they might be doing general ministry, throughout their 20s, 30s, maybe 40s, and then only get to focus ministry and never get to convergent ministry. So that's fairly common. So there's subphases in these that he talks about in the book. So in addition to the 4 phases, he has subphases, and you can read in more detail about the book. But phase 2 have provisional ministry, growth ministry, and competent ministry. And then phase 3 has role transition and unique ministry. And then phase 4 has special guidance, convergent ministry, and then afterglow is considered a subphase. So, let's talk a little bit about the ministry maturing, or sometimes called the general ministry phase, and what the subphases are. So often what's going to happen is you have the entry phase. So that's where you might get your first job where you're doing ministry. So if you're at a parachurch or a church or a nonprofit, then that becomes pretty clear. If you're not, then it might be that you've been working in a business environment and you actually start to think, you know what, my job is my ministry in addition to my family and other things. And you start to have that mindset. So you're going to have these things that Clinton calls process items, and you can read more about that in the book, but he has these various process items. And you have all of these phases. So you go into entry, you're going to get training, you're going to go through relational learning. So in training, you'll get ministry skills, training experience, you're going to discover your own giftedness. That's part of why you're in school with City Vision, to go through another round of training, right? You're going to have relational learning where you're being mentored, and you might have conflict, you might have, leadership backlash, and then discernment. You might have, spiritual warfare, issues of prayer, issues where you're called out in ministry. And between each stage, you have these boundary events. So this slide shows 3 boundary events on top of the ministry timeline, and the abbreviations are B1, B2, and B3. So B1 is the logistics barrier. So for a lot of people who want to go into full-time, so-called full-time ministry, the biggest issue is the logistics. They have to pay for themselves to do that. So how are they going to do that? Can they, raise the money for that? If you're launching a church, can you, get enough to support yourself? So often there's just logistical issues. If you're trying to get hired by a nonprofit or ministry, it's, can you get hired? And then the next boundary event is what he calls the doing to being. So to go from general ministry to focus ministry, often he says the biggest thing is, we're not human doings, we're human beings, right? And we need to really live that out, not just in our heads, but to just be able to sit with God. A friend of mine used to call herself servant, and then around this transition time in her life, she started calling herself daughter. And I think that, other people have termed it, going from spiritual slaves to spiritual sons, or, spiritual daughters, right? And I think that there's a huge heart level shift there. And then boundary 3 is really where all the things in your life align, and you are, you're in the middle of what God's called you to do, and, the wind's behind your sails and you're flying. So that, getting to that boundary condition. So let's talk a little bit about what boundary events are. So boundary events, So boundary events, really, let me go into the next slide. They define a point on a timeline where the two phases meet, or two subphases meet, where there's a significant change in ministry. So what he uses as a technical definition is a boundary point represents the end of one subphase or phase and the beginning of a new subphase or point of significant change from one ministry assignment to another. So using that definition, boundary events can come about as a result of a crisis, a promotion, a new ministry, learning a major new concept, having unusual experiences, life-changing encounters with a person or with God, even in the middle of your ministry, a divine guidance experience, a geographic move. So all of these things. So the reason why we're teaching you this is we're going to want you to use these concepts to create a timeline for yourself. So that's why we're doing that. Now, in this, the brackets around them show the time around there, and the longer line with the arrows show the total time. So a lot of times, it could be a period of years where you're going through that phase. Now, one of the things that's often talked about, especially with Clinton, he talks about it is, few finish well. And he talks about that often people have a hard time crossing the boundary. So I've known a lot of people who, they want to start a nonprofit, they want to start a ministry, they want to start a church, but they're not willing to work for anyone else. So they never actually get through the logistical issue. And that can be a challenge. Or it could also be, if you're working in the business world, you never actually start to act as if your work is your ministry, right? So, and this, moving from general ministry to doing to being. So the size of these triangles show what proportion Clinton believes actually get there. So if there's millions of people at this level, there might be say 10 million at the people at this level, there might be 5 million at this level, but down here you might get a few 100,000, and here you might get a few thousand, right? Part of what Clinton says is that most major failures or stagnation in ministry are rooted in spiritual formation issues rather than ministerial or strategic formation issues. Now, I'm going to talk later, once we get into the cross-cultural thing. I think sometimes, especially around the convergence, there's this cultural convergence where, honestly, it's easier for white male men to find cultural convergence in the world than it is for people of color or, women, just because of the way the systems work. That also can be a barrier. So, some of this I feel like true. Most of the people he studied were men, so I think that it applies. But so in his case, whenever he was looking at the men in leadership, he said that most of the failures or stagnation was rooted in spiritual formation rather than ministerial or strategic formation issues, and they can be traced to basic breaches of integrity where ministers can't move past some form of self-deception. So that's part of the purpose of this exercise. As I'm going through and teaching this, I'm thinking through, where am I? Where am I being held? What are the mindsets that God, what's the lesson God's trying to teach me in this? And we want you to be doing the same as you go through this. So, and I'm going to go into this in more detail. As I mentioned before, phase 2 starts where you overcome the logistic barrier. So you're able to support yourself in full-time ministry through either self-support or salary. And then the general ministry goes through the provisional growth and competent ministry. And you develop a lot of your abilities, and, God's really developing you as a person. So, and then, he's basically saying, can I trust you? For a lot of people, this would be Moses, his, 40 years in the desert, or Joseph, in Potiphar's house, he talks about that. And then focus ministry, or, ultimately what you're going to do is you're going to be focused more on being, and you're going to have some sort of event that helps you go beyond the plateau and helps you get out of, whatever your rut. If you just become too settled, and will you rely just on yourself and your knowledge, or will you trust God to move to the next level? And often that's where things work. So one of the examples that's often used, and I believe Clinton also uses this, is A.W. Tozer. I realize his examples are largely about white dudes, but let's just use the example to teach the concept. 1897 all the way through 1963. So many of you have probably heard of Tozer, and he had boundary one was his conversion experience in 1919, and he immediately decided to go work as an associate pastor in another church, and that offered him on-the-job training for ministry task and allowed him to grow. And then the next transition for him was whenever he accepted the call to a Chicago ministry, and he had a major change in ministry focus to a large city church, moving from rural to a large city urban environment. And he became a citywide leader, and God gave him a developmental task of influence challenging. And Tozer had to develop capacities beyond the small town thinking and to network across a large geographic center where he could minister and be nationally noticed. And then in phase 3, he transitioned from that because he felt like he was convicted to step back from the weekly, ministry that he was doing as a large city pastor into a ministry that involved contemplation, studying, and writing. If you've ever I've read some of Tozer's books. Most of what he's known for now is from this phase. So he felt the need to transition to this task, and it was really happened through what's called negative preparation, where Clinton says, a negative event happened. So he had to step down from his church for the church to expand. And that allowed him also to just reflect on his lifetime of learning. So you have this boundary processing. At the beginning of a boundary event, you might do a lot of backward reflection. In it, you might do a lot of upward reflection, meaning you're going to look to God and you're going to say, God, why did you allow all this to happen? And then at the end, you're going to start thinking about forward. Okay, what is it you're calling me to? And ultimately, that is what we're trying to do in this course, is we're trying to say, whatever the nearest boundary is, that's where we want you to focus. So we are providing this same template, as you go to the book, and you're going to try to translate the concepts from the book into the template that you're going to use in your final project in the course. Keep in mind this slide, because it's going to help you do that translation, because there's slightly different names, and I explain how the names relate in the template. So this week you're going to be doing a live meeting where you can share some about your journey, and we're going to give you a template for that live meeting. And in the template, what we want you to do is to go through, and you can move these parentheses and you can add names, and we'll provide this. And what we want you to do is to give the name of a boundary phase for you. When did you transition between these, and what the dates were, and you can put it, as long as you want. And for most people, you're going to be, maybe in between phases 1 and 3. Very few students are likely to be in phase 4 ministry, but a few of you might be. So we want you to use this template as you share with others. During the live meeting, you're going to come and talk about your journey. Now, if you can't figure out the logistics of the template, that's fine. If you can't figure out the logistics of sharing your screen, then that's fine also. But if you're able to, try to figure it out. And the end goal for your project at the end of week 2 is to go through this thing called the reflective evaluation pattern. So And the steps that Clinton outlines is God initiates intense processing to gain the attention of a leader. So many of us have gone through crisis right now as I record this. It's the minute we're in the middle of COVID-19 lockdown, right? So that's getting a lot of people's attention. And, people are saying this is the global reset. Everyone's going through a reset. So we have time. God's getting our attention, right? And then we're forced to do this serious reflection about ministry life and ultimate reality. And then you do an evaluation of that results in formative thinking and commitment to growth. So this is what we're trying to get you to do in this course. This is the big goal. What's the big idea of this course? And we want you to use that so you have renewed determination to know God more deeply, and then ultimately that God would bless that, your commitment and the renewed determination, by deepening his relationship between you and God, and ultimately that's the goal. Now, the major project, there's going to be two parts of it. There's going to be an analysis part of it and synthesis, and one of the videos this week talks about the difference between analysis and synthesis. But in this, analysis is breaking things up. It's breaking it up into stages. So I want you to use Clinton. The main value I see of Clinton's tool is allows you to break up your life and reflect using some of these stages. Now, we're going to have you go through that, and let me just show you the tool that you're going to use. Is you're going to use this this ministry, this major project reflective leadership paper. And what you're going to do is you're going to fill out. So this first part, as I mentioned, is just, it's going to be analysis. So, and your end product should be to fill in this document here. And we have renamed these to help you with the mapping in the 4 phases. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to give a name to each phase. Going to give a timeline of these phases, and if you want to list, your timeline for sovereign foundations until you became a Christian, and then where you came into leadership, and then you're going to want to do these process items. Now, there is an absolutely amazing tool to help you do the process items, and there is this, and it's linked here, and it's linked in the week, and there's a group called Leader Breakthrough, and they have a Post-it note timeline. And there's 2 parts to the Post-it note timeline. There is the video that goes with that, and then there's also a PDF. And the idea is it's going to give you instructions, and in these instructions you can use real Post-it notes if you're familiar with Post-it notes. But there's also if you can't find those, you can just type in sticky online. So there's a bunch of sticky note tools that you can use online, Notely or others if you want to use sticky notes. And the idea is this is going to be a brainstorming tool for you. So you could just write down all your life events, and if you go to the PDF instruction idea, so part of what he does is he says, okay, let's write down all your life events. So and one's just brainstorming, and then you're going to have different things, people who influence your life, events that influence. Then you're going to go and talk about painful moments, and then you're going to try to organize them. So it may be hard to get everything to fit into Clinton's mold, but part of the purpose of this exercise is to help you brainstorm them, and then you can move them into chapters in your story. And then he calls these things turning points, right? So these are going to be boundary events, the equivalent of boundary events. And then, he talks about how to get lessons out of this. So I would recommend you do this. You're not going to have to turn in this part because that's going to be basically a brainstorming. So this is, step 2. So, and then what we want you to do is describe 9 process items. And this is using the definition of Clinton, but that's ultimately what those sticky notes are going to be. So he uses examples of process items. So family, environment, historical events. It could be a book you read or a mentor. And he defines all these terms of these process items. So your sticky notes are going to be all these items down here. So the idea is you want to have a bunch of sticky notes, and then you're going to have to figure out how do you align them into these phases. And then from that, you're going to reflect on the boundary events, right? So what were the big things that got you to move from one phase to another? Like whenever I first moved from Sovereign Foundations, what drove me to become a Christian, right? That's pretty easy for a lot of people to think through. But then what drove me to decide to enter ministry, right? And so this is all in the analysis domain, right? So, but we want you to do a synthesis. And ultimately what we're trying to do in this is get you to go through these 5 steps. And we want you to write a 1,500 to 2,500 word paper in the second part. So you should put all this down here. And then once you're done, remove the instructions before submitting the document. So and just to emphasize, our goal is that you could use this as a tool to reflect on the past, season that you've been in life. So focus most of your paper. I don't want you to write, 100 words for each year of your life, right? That's not the point. I would encourage you to focus most of it on what's the most significant boundary event that you might be in the middle of, or things that you're processing. And, you want to go and focus most of your effort in your synthesis paper on that. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have any questions, ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot. Bye.